Just now, behind the guarded hedges of Montecito and the silent stone corridors of Windsor, a quiet shift has triggered alarm at the very core of the British monarchy. What appeared until days ago to be routine royal distance has reportedly hardened into something far more consequential, a coordinated withdrawal with institutional implications. According to sources with direct knowledge of internal briefings, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have effectively vanished from their usual Montecito patterns at the same moment the Riven Rock estate quietly surfaced on private real estate channels. No press release, no public explanation, no casual denial, only silence. And that silence, insiders say, is what set off internal alerts inside the royal system. The timing has unsettled officials far beyond family concern. This is no longer framed as a personal relocation or lifestyle decision. Reportedly, senior aides inside Buckingham Palace and Clarence House are now treating the development as a potential structural risk, one that intersects with legal standing, financial exposure, and the monarchy's long-term containment strategy regarding the Sussex separation. What makes this moment explosive is not the sale itself, but the sequence. Sources claim the property move occurred after weeks of closed-door consultations involving legal advisors familiar with the Privy Council's advisory frameworks and the residual powers embedded in the letters patent of 1917. These mechanisms were never designed for headlines. They were designed for containment during moments of instability. Publicly, the narrative has been that distance equals detachment. Privately, that assumption is reportedly being reassessed, because distance, when combined with asset liquidation, can signal preparation, not retreat. Inside royal briefings, the phrase now circulating is jurisdictional drift. It refers to a scenario in which royal-linked figures reposition themselves outside predictable legal, financial, and symbolic oversight. That possibility, insiders say, is precisely what senior officials have worked for years to prevent. King Charles III, according to those familiar with the situation, has been presented with preliminary assessments outlining potential exposure, not emotional, but institutional. What happens if royal linked assets are moved beyond traditional leverage? What happens if silence becomes strategy? The question now dominating palace discussions is stark. Is this merely a quiet sale, or the opening move in a confrontation the monarchy has been trying to delay? And if so, what legal instruments are already being prepared to respond? Within hours of the Montecito signals being flagged, the response inside royal governance circles reportedly shifted from observation to preparation. This was no longer about tracking movements. This was about identifying leverage. According to sources familiar with internal advisory channels, legal counsel attached to the crown began revisiting dormant constitutional tools, mechanisms rarely discussed publicly, yet still active within Britain's unwritten constitutional framework. At the center of those discussions was the residual authority of the monarch acting through advisory bodies connected to the Privy Council, and the interpretive reach of the letters patent of 1917. These instruments, insiders stress, are not weapons in the conventional sense. They are structural safeguards designed to preserve institutional coherence when individuals linked to the crown operate beyond expected boundaries. And reportedly, advisors began asking an uncomfortable question. Does the quiet listing of Riven Rock constitute a material shift that triggers institutional review? One senior source described the internal tone as procedural, not punitive. The objective, they claim, is not confrontation, it is containment. If assets associated with royal status are moved, restructured, or shielded beyond traditional oversight, the institution must determine whether symbolic privileges, titles, or residual protections still apply in the same way. This is where the legal tension intensifies. While Prince Harry remains the son of the reigning monarch, his legal position is not immune to review under advisory frameworks when actions intersect with the Crown's reputational or financial exposure. Sources say briefing papers now circulating include scenarios involving title limitation, advisory status recalibration, and security entitlement reassessment, all framed as contingency options, not decisions. Crucially, insiders emphasize that none of this would be triggered by a single property transaction. What matters is pattern, timing, silence, and intent. The fact that the Riven Rock estate allegedly appeared on discrete listing networks rather than open market channels has reportedly raised eyebrows. It suggests, according to one advisor, a desire for control rather than visibility. And control, when exercised outside institutional alignment, invites scrutiny. At Windsor Castle, officials are said to be coordinating with Treasury-linked analysts to assess downstream exposure, particularly if property liquidation affects contractual obligations, security costs, or financial representations tied to past arrangements. Yet even as legal mechanisms are dusted off, a deeper concern has begun to surface inside the system, because legal tools only matter if there is something to enforce. And that has led to the next more destabilizing question now being whispered in closed rooms. What if the sale is not the story, but the evidence trail it leaves behind? Because once financial records move, they rarely move alone. And sources suggest that what follows could reframe the entire crisis as something far more serious than distance. As legal frameworks were quietly reactivated, attention reportedly shifted to something far more volatile than constitutional theory, documentation. Because when property moves, paper follows. And according to multiple sources, it was the paper trail linked to Riven Rock that triggered a sharp escalation inside royal briefings. Insiders claim that preliminary financial reviews flagged anomalies not in ownership itself, but in structuring, shell arrangements, intermediary holding entities, advisory firms with no prior connection to royal linked assets. None of it illegal on its face, none of it simple either. And simplicity, sources say, is usually the rule when royal advisors are involved. What unsettled officials was the apparent absence of customary coordination. Traditionally, even distant royal family members maintain a degree of disclosure when assets intersect with past security provisions, tax representations, or legacy funding agreements. In this case, sources allege that alignment was missing. One internal memo, described by a source who claims to have seen it, allegedly used the phrase informational breach. Not betrayal in the emotional sense, but deviation from established protocols designed to protect the crown from indirect exposure. When those protocols are bypassed, questions follow quickly. At the center of concern is whether third party financial advisors, potentially operating outside UK jurisdiction, were engaged without institutional awareness. If confirmed, that would represent a fundamental shift, not merely independence, but insulation. And insulation is where suspicion deepens, because insulation suggests anticipation. Sources say Palace analysts are now cross-referencing the timing of the listing with prior media contracts, charitable restructurings, and international appearances. The goal is not accusation, it is coherence. Do these moves align with a long-term disengagement strategy, or do they point towards something more deliberate? Adding to the unease is the reported involvement of non-traditional brokers with political and corporate backgrounds rather than standard luxury real estate channels. That choice alone, advisors argue, alters the risk profile. Inside Buckingham Palace, the tone has reportedly hardened. One official allegedly remarked that distance becomes defiance when it avoids accountability. Strong words, and not spoken lightly. Yet the most destabilizing development is still unfolding. Sources suggest that a deadline has now been informally established, not announced, not documented, but understood. A window in which explanations can be offered, alignments clarified, or silence maintained. And silence in this moment may carry consequences no one publicly wants to name, because once that window closes, the issue will no longer be about property. It will be about intent. And intent, insiders warn, changes everything. By the time the internal reviews reached King Charles III's red boxes, the tone had reportedly shifted from inquiry to urgency. What had begun as cautious monitoring was now operating under an unspoken clock, one that insiders describe as procedural but unforgiving. According to sources familiar with palace operations, an informal deadline has emerged. Not a written order, not a public demand, but a clearly understood window in which clarification is expected. In royal systems, silence is rarely neutral. It is interpreted, logged, and eventually acted upon. Advisors are said to have warned the king that prolonged ambiguity surrounding the Riven Rock estate could trigger automatic review mechanisms tied to security arrangements, legacy funding expectations, and residual institutional obligations. These mechanisms do not require public confrontation. They activate quietly, through recalibration rather than decree. What intensifies the pressure is timing. The reported listing coincides with upcoming fiscal assessments linked to Royal linked security reimbursements and long-standing cross-border arrangements negotiated during earlier transition phases. If those assessments proceed without clarity, default assumptions may change. One source described it starkly: if the institution cannot explain the move, it must plan as if it was excluded by design, and exclusion carries consequences. Within Clarence House, discussions have reportedly turned to optics as well as law. The monarchy, already navigating a delicate balance between modern distance and symbolic unity, cannot afford a perception of fragmentation driven by asset repositioning, especially not when it appears coordinated and silent. This is where family history begins to intersect with institutional memory. Senior courtiers are said to have drawn comparisons, not publicly but privately, to past moments when royal figures acted independently under the belief that distance guaranteed autonomy. History, they note, did not reward those assumptions. The pressure is now twofold. Externally, the palace must prepare for questions it cannot yet answer. Internally, it must decide how long it can wait before silence becomes precedent. Sources say the king has been advised that a response window, measured in weeks, not months, is closing. After that point, recalibration may proceed without consultation, and that recalibration would not target individuals directly. It would target roles, security protocols, advisory access, symbolic recognition, each quietly adjusted under established authority. This is where the crisis pivots, because beyond the deadlines and documents lies something more volatile than legal exposure: legacy. What does it mean, insiders now ask, for a son of the monarch to appear disengaged at a moment when continuity is paramount? And if that question remains unanswered, the institution may be forced to answer it on his behalf, which leads directly into the most painful arena of all: family and inheritance. As procedural deadlines tightened, the crisis reportedly crossed an invisible threshold, from governance into lineage, because within the monarchy, legacy is not sentimental, it is structural. And when legacy appears unsettled, every institution built upon it feels the strain. Sources say that inside Windsor Castle, discussions have turned to questions that cannot be solved by legal memos alone. What does it mean for the continuity of the crown when a direct descendant operates beyond the gravitational pull of tradition, protocol, and visibility? And more critically, what precedents are quietly being set? King Charles III, according to those familiar with the briefings, has been forced into a position no reigning monarch welcomes, balancing paternal restraint against institutional obligation. He is not merely a father weighing family pain, he is the custodian of a system designed to outlast personal relationships. At stake is not inheritance in the conventional sense, but symbolic succession, access to archives, association with royal vaults, participation in legacy institutions that shape historical narrative rather than immediate power. These are privileges rarely discussed publicly, yet fiercely protected behind closed doors. Sources allege that advisors have raised concerns about whether prolonged disengagement could necessitate a reevaluation of such associations, not as punishment, but as consequence. The institution, they argue, cannot extend symbolic continuity to those who decline reciprocal alignment. Prince William's position, insiders suggest, has also become central. As the future king, his role is increasingly defined by containment, not confrontation, but preservation. Reports indicate that he has been briefed on potential outcomes and is acutely aware that whatever precedent is set now will shape his reign long before it begins. This is where emotion and authority collide, because family history within the House of Windsor is filled with moments when personal choices forced institutional reckoning, abdications, exiles, quiet exclusions that rewrote access without rewriting bloodlines. The Montecito silence, coupled with asset repositioning, has reportedly revived those memories, not as threats, but as warnings. One source described the mood as somber but resolute. There is no appetite for drama, but there is a recognition that inaction carries its own risk. If explanation does not arrive, alignment must be assumed absent, and absence within this system demands response, which is why discussions have now turned to strategy, not emotional appeals, but calculated counter moves designed to protect the Crown's authority, narrative control, and institutional coherence, because once legacy is questioned, it must be defended. And defense in royal terms is never passive. With legacy now formally part of the equation, sources say the monarchy's response has shifted into a quieter, more deliberate phase. This is the stage where strategy replaces sentiment, where moves are designed not to provoke reaction, but to stabilize outcomes. According to insiders familiar with high-level planning, a series of countermoves has been outlined, each calibrated to protect institutional authority without triggering public escalation. These are not dramatic gestures. They are structural adjustments, subtle, reversible in theory, but powerful in practice. One such move reportedly under discussion involves recalibrating access, not revoking, not denying, but redefining. Access to advisory briefings, invitations to ceremonial frameworks, even the language used in internal correspondence. Each change signals alignment or distance without public declaration. Another strategic layer centers on narrative control. Sources claim senior communications advisors have been instructed to prepare parallel messaging tracks, one assuming clarification arrives, the other assuming prolonged silence. In the latter scenario, visibility is minimized. Mentions become contextual rather than central. Absence is normalized. Perhaps most significant, however, is the reported decision to decouple institutional continuity from individual participation. In practical terms, this means reinforcing the visibility of working royals, redistributing ceremonial presence, and strengthening public association with figures who remain within the system's operational framework. Prince William, insiders suggest, has been integral to this planning, not as an aggressor, but as a stabilizer. His involvement signals long-term intent, a monarchy that moves forward regardless of individual alignment, yet strategy is never purely symbolic. Beneath these adjustments lies a more concrete concern: resources, security arrangements, property-related obligations, insurance frameworks. Each carries cost, and cost requires justification. Sources say financial analysts attached to the royal household have begun scenario modeling that assumes reduced institutional responsibility for assets and individuals operating beyond direct oversight. This is where the pressure sharpens, because once financial models shift, they rarely revert without cause. The Riven Rock listing, according to advisors, may not trigger immediate change, but combined with sustained silence, it could accelerate recalibration, particularly in areas where public funding intersects with private decisions. And that recalibration would not arrive as an announcement. It would arrive as a notice, a quiet adjustment, a line item altered, which brings the crisis into its next, most tangible phase. Because when resources tighten, distance becomes expensive, and expense forces decisions. As strategic recalibration moved from planning to projection, the conversation reportedly turned to numbers, not symbolic costs, real ones. And those figures, sources say, have begun to reshape the gravity of the situation. At the center of this phase is security, the most sensitive and least negotiable expense tied to royal association. According to insiders familiar with household budgeting, security frameworks linked to Prince Harry were always conditional, reviewed periodically, and partially justified by residual institutional roles. Once those roles blur, so does the justification. Sources allege that financial analysts have now modeled scenarios in which long-standing security assumptions no longer apply. The results, described as sobering, suggest a steep increase in private expenditure should institutional support be reduced or redefined. In practical terms, independence comes with a price, and that price compounds over time. The Riven Rock estate itself reportedly features in these calculations. Large properties require layered security, specialized insurance, and continuous logistical oversight. If the estate is sold, interim arrangements become even more complex. Temporary residences, transitional vulnerabilities, All of it increases cost at precisely the moment institutional backing may be reassessed. But security is only one axis. Sources say contractual obligations tied to previous media, philanthropic, and advisory ventures are also under review. These agreements, while private, often contain clauses referencing stability, location, and risk profile. A sudden shift in residence, and especially one executed quietly, can trigger renegotiation or exposure. Inside Palace finance briefings, one phrase is reportedly being repeated: resource symmetry. It refers to the balance between support given and alignment maintained. When that balance tilts, recalibration follows. This is not framed as retaliation, it is framed as arithmetic. What makes the moment particularly acute is timing. Global security costs have risen. Insurance markets have tightened. Private protection at royal equivalent levels now demands unprecedented resources. Without institutional buffers, the financial strain becomes immediate, and strain, insiders warn, rarely remains financial. It bleeds into decision making, into isolation, into pressure points that compromise strategic flexibility. One source described it bluntly: once you fund everything yourself, every move becomes heavier. As these calculations circulate, the psychological dimension of the crisis deepens because behind the figures lies a narrowing corridor of options. Silence becomes harder to maintain, distance becomes harder to finance, and isolation, once chosen, begins to feel imposed, which sets the stage for the most destabilizing phase yet. Not legal, not financial, psychological. As financial pressures converged with institutional distance, sources say the atmosphere surrounding the Montecito silence has grown markedly tense. This is the phase insiders describe as the psychological narrowing, when strategic space contracts and every option carries weight. According to individuals familiar with the situation, prolonged silence does not just communicate resolve, it amplifies scrutiny. Each day without clarification reportedly fuels internal assumptions that alignment is no longer a priority. And once that assumption takes hold, reentry becomes exponentially more difficult. Isolation in this context is not merely geographic, it is procedural. Invitations slow, informal channels go quiet. Advisory back channels, once taken for granted, begin to close, not as punishment, but as protocol. The system protects itself by reducing variables. Sources claim this has created a siege like dynamic. Decisions that once involved consultation now require anticipation. Moves must be planned without the benefit of institutional foresight. And that, insiders warn, introduces vulnerability. Psychological pressure intensifies when uncertainty meets visibility. Every public appearance, every absence, every contractual adjustment is reportedly weighed for signal. Is this defiance, preparation, or retreat? Without explanation, interpretation fills the vacuum. One advisor described the effect as strategic claustrophobia. Options narrow, time compresses, silence, once a shield, becomes exposure. Within royal circles, there is also a recognition that emotional narratives, while compelling publicly, carry limited weight institutionally. What matters now is alignment, demonstrated, not declared. This is where the human cost becomes visible. Sources suggest that stress levels have risen sharply, not because of a single decision, but because of cumulative uncertainty. When the system around you recalibrates quietly, you feel it long before it announces itself. And yet, even now, the door is not fully closed. There remains, insiders say, a final moment, not for negotiation, but for signal, a gesture, a clarification, a recalibration of tone. Because once the institution moves into its final phase, it does so with momentum. And momentum in royal systems is difficult to reverse. Which brings the crisis to its defining question: is this a moment of principle or miscalculation? The answer, sources suggest, will determine not just titles or property, but historical framing, and that framing will not be written by those who remain silent. In the end, the monarchy does not issue verdicts in the language of accusation. It allows history to render them. And according to sources close to the institution, that process has already begun. What the quiet listing of Riven Rock, the sustained absence from Montecito routines, and the prolonged silence toward royal channels have collectively produced is not outrage, but assessment. The crown, as an institution, is not emotional, it is archival. It observes patterns, weighs continuity, and records alignment over time. From that perspective, this moment will not be remembered for a single decision, but for accumulation, silence upon silence, distance layered upon distance, each move individually defensible, collectively consequential. Insiders stress that no doors have been publicly closed, no declarations made, no punishments announced. And yet, recalibration has occurred. The monarchy has quietly adjusted its center of gravity, reinforcing those who remain operationally aligned and preparing for a future in which independence is treated as separation, not protest. This is the moral fault line now exposed. Institutions survive by coherence, individuals survive by autonomy. When the two collide, neither emerges unchanged. Prince Harry's position, sources say, will ultimately be framed not by grievance or reconciliation, but by choice. The choice to explain or not, to align or not, to participate or not. And history, unlike family, does not negotiate. For King Charles III, this moment represents the defining tension of his reign, preserving humanity without compromising structure. For Prince William, it is a rehearsal in authority, learning that continuity